Well, good morning, everyone. Boy, we sure notice when Peter's not with us.
Good morning, Jim.
Thanks, Jose. Please turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13. We are going to spend most of our time this morning in this passage. I do reserve the right to jump around a little bit, but for the most part, we're going to spend time in Matthew chapter 13. Well, Tony and Alva lived in London, England, and at the outbreak of World War II, they found themselves hunkered down in their home because, as many of you know, World War II history, the Germans went on quite a bombing campaign. And Tony was a musician, let's say an unemployed musician, turned war factory worker. But before the war, he had the opportunity to perform gigs for weekend parties of perhaps the rich and famous. And at these parties, people would, they did these role plays. This is back a long time ago. They would do these murder mystery role plays. Well, when Tony and Alva were hunkered down in their home and trying to survive the bombings, they invented a game that was based on what he had experienced before about this idea of a murder mystery. And this board game, it was actually in 1944, and for those that are arithmetically challenged, that's 80 years ago now. He patented something that he called Cluedo. And it was a game that since that time has now sold over 150 million copies, probably closer to 200 million. And we know it as Clue. So apparently in North America, nobody knew what Cluedo meant, and so they just changed it to Clue. And of course, as we all know, if you played the game, Colonel Mustard did the deed in the library with the candlestick. But anyway, it's a game some of you may be familiar with. You know what? Everybody loves a murder mystery. You can sit there if you're TV surfing or something, and you're always going to come across a murder mystery, and everybody just absolutely loves a murder mystery. Well, there is a mystery in the Bible, but it is no game. So we're going to explore this a little bit today, this idea of mystery, with a specific focus on Matthew chapter 13. Well, the word mystery, Amy always says, now if you're going to focus on a word, you better make sure what the Greek word is for that. And so I did do that this time. And the Greek word is mysterion. And you'll notice that it's very close. It's actually called a transliteration. The translators didn't. They just simply took the word and kind of made it English sounding, I guess. And if in Spanish, Julio, is it probably a similar word? Well, the word, this word mystery is found 27 times in the New Testament. And interesting enough, the Apostle Paul wrote, he wrote half the books in the New Testament but he actually only wrote about a quarter of the content because he did a lot of little books compared to, say, Luke, etc. But anyway, so he wrote about a quarter of the New Testament, but out of those 27 references, Paul uses the word mystery on 21 times. So that just leaves 6 now for the rest of the New Testament. In the Gospels, there is only one time that Jesus actually uses the word mystery. And that one time is covered off in 3 different Gospels, but they're parallel. And that's what we're going to look at today, Matthew 13, Mark chapter 4, and Luke chapter 8. Now, you could look at this passage from all three of them. I just found that Matthew was a little bit richer in content. It was a little more comprehensive. Matthew covered off perhaps more than what was in the other two. So I don't think we'll do much flipping back and forth, so I think you're safe. Just stay with that. Now, going back to Paul's reference, before I actually get into the Gospels, is that I looked through the 21 references that Paul made to this, and I just tried to bundle these things up into four categories. And the categories are the nature and character of God. Salvation through Jesus was referred to as a mystery. Christ's bride, the church, is a mystery, and salvation was to also include the Gentiles. And so that gives a little bit of a synopsis there. But now let's again focus on Matthew chapter 13. So you might think I'm going to start with Matthew verse 1 of chapter 13, but I'm actually going to start in the middle. So bear with me. We will roll back to verse 1, but I want to draw your attention to verse 10 and following. And in Matthew, he says, so a little bit of context is that Jesus has just shared a parable, and we'll go and look at that parable in a few minutes. And the parable, interesting enough, we know that Jesus taught in parables quite often. But this was the first recorded parable, and it was a parable that caught the attention of Jesus' disciples. And so the Jesus' disciples in verse 10 said, "Why do you use parables when you talk to the people?" Kind of different. And Jesus said, "You are permitted to understand the mystery of the kingdom of heaven." Some versions you might have the secrets. Well, it's the same Greek word, secrets, mystery of the kingdom of heaven. But others are not. To those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given, and they will have an abundance of knowledge. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. This is why I use parables. This point here. For they look, but they don't really see. They hear, but they don't really listen or understand. Wow. So you go through that, and it's like, whew, what are we going to do with that? There seems to be a lot to unpack in that section. And it raises some questions. Well, what is this mystery of the kingdom of heaven? So is Jesus really using parables to intentionally thwart the listeners from understanding? Is he intentionally hiding the gospel from people by using parables? And that actually seems kind of strange because, we have different understanding what parables are. You've got an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, but it's generally, I think we generally buy into the idea that a parable is where you use like an illustration, you use a story to make it easier for people to understand. Wouldn't you think that that's maybe a good definition of a parable? Well, at least in this particular case, Jesus is saying that's not the case. He says, I'm using parables so you can understand, to his disciples, but to other people that they won't understand. And it even goes on to say, otherwise, in quoting Scripture, which we'll get to later, but he identifies that they might not even be forgiven if they don't understand. So we definitely have a mystery here, right? A mystery of what the mystery is. A mystery of a mystery. And we want to take a closer look at this mystery. Okay, so I've been a little unfair in that I've kind of dived right into the middle of these 20 verses or so. And so we need to kind of take one step back out and give a little bit of context. Mark, in his letter, identifies, I would just ask the question, where is Jesus when he's talking here? or at least when he's giving this parable? Well, Mark says he's in a boat. And you know why he's in a boat? He's in a boat because there's huge, massive crowds crushing him, probably almost, I won't say threatening isn't the word, but concerning to him. So much so that he got in a boat and he got a little bit offshore. Some people say it also helps with the acoustics. But regardless, Jesus is in a boat, and he shares the following story with them. Beginning in verse 3. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and birds came up and ate it. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell in the good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So this is the passage that triggers that question that we visited earlier, where he said, why do you speak this way? We look at it, we go, well, maybe we're familiar with this story. What do most people call this parable? The parable of? The parable of the sower. Right. So I'll get this one out of the way. I don't really think it's the parable of the sower. I know it's got a title in my Bible, but people have added that. It's really a parable of the soils. It's a parable that's talking about these 4 different soils and what happens to the seed and to what extent the seed produces because of the soils. And maybe I'm getting into a little definition of that. And one beauty of this parable is that Jesus actually does come back later and define the parable. So this chapter has these 3 sections. It has the parable itself, which we just read. It has, later on, which we haven't covered yet, Jesus gives an explanation of the parable. That's always kind of, for a teacher, that's kind of cool. We don't have to dream up what this might mean. We can just kind of read a few verses later. And then smack dab, right in the middle, you got that passage that we read initially, which was like this, from our perspective, kind of this awkward, almost seems a little out of context, kind of breaks the flow. You got this beautiful parable and beautiful explanation, and Jesus jams right into the middle of that. This thing about, they see but they don't see, they hear but they don't hear. It's almost like Jesus doesn't want them to understand. So that's kind of how I viewed this in the past. I always thought this was an evangelistic parable as well, but it's not a parable. It's not about that. I believe it's a Christian life and a Christian responsibility parable. But I always felt the question that was in the middle was an outflow of the parable. In other words, the main point here is the parable, and that the question was the outflow. And when I was studying and preparing for this, I kind of shifted my thinking. I was like, wait a second. The explanation of the parable that we're going to get to in a minute is the answer to the question. And then I've looked at this passage from a totally new way, that it's the question that's the centerpiece and Jesus' answer. And the parable is actually complementary to the question. Now, I don't know if that makes sense in my mind. Instead of the question just being an outflow of the parable, the parable is actually, I think, a supporting of the answer to the question. Hopefully you'll see that in a little bit as we move through this. So because the apostles asked that question, what do the parables mean? We can probably deduce from that they were. Well, actually, I'll cover that point in a minute. I'm going to come back to just one thing before that. What we do identify in this is, number one, the disciples were, in the one version, permitted to understand the knowledge of the mystery of the kingdom of heaven. So whatever the mystery of the kingdom is, the disciples, it's like they had the key to that. They had that understanding. Yet, it seems outsiders were not permitted to understand that mystery. So again, a bit of a head scratcher. And Jesus himself said in his answer that Jesus used parables, this teaching style, to ensure that others would not understand. So again, quite a quandary there, or certainly somewhat of a conflict. Okay. I think to give just a little bit more context, we're going to make a very quick dash back 700 years to the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 6, because this is what Matthew, Mark, and Luke quote Jesus as quoting. So Jesus had quoted, and let me read this again, what he quotes. In fact, it says in verse 14 of Matthew 13, Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, you will listen and listen, but never understand. You will look and look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown callous. Their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn back, and I would heal them. Well, when I explored back into Isaiah chapter 6, I was like, oh man, there's a whole sermon here. This is a fascinating passage. And this is a passage that's referred to as Isaiah's call and Isaiah's mission. And we're not going to dive too deep into Isaiah right now, who he was, when he was. We've actually had a pretty good discussion about Isaiah in our Wednesday evening classes. We've been looking at some kings of Israel and Judah. And but in a nutshell, it is a vision of Isaiah at God's throne. And God's throne room is completely full of the tail of his robe. It's just completely filled. And in this, there's a sequence of events that God declares who is going to take the message. And Isaiah, in this very humbling moment, extremely humbling moment, says, send me, I will take this message. And so God then commissions Isaiah. And this is Isaiah's commission. Remember, he's probably a young man at this point in time, perhaps has 40 years worth of preaching. And hopefully he can reach the people, and his preaching can have some good, and there can be a good outcome. God tells him right off the bat, he says, verse 9, go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding, be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused. Make their ears dull and close their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. So again, maybe mystery on mystery, but it seems to be saying the more Isaiah was to preach to a hardened listener, the greater the hardening was going to occur. And the final outcome, he goes on further in Isaiah 6, the final outcome, he's going to preach until there's utter destruction and devastation and turmoil in the land. So there's a real good motivation speech from the boss when you're going to go out on your mission, and that's what it's going to be. So this is just a little bit of a setup. So Jesus is saying, this is fulfilled in me. So, conclusion, not conclusion of the sermon, don't pack up yet. Conclusion of this little point is Jesus intentionally wanting to teach people who are calloused and hard so they will become more calloused and more hard. So think of that as we go through just a few more comments. In the Gospel of John, chapter 8. Now, John, interesting enough, didn't cover off the parable of the soils or the parable of the sower, but I had to fit John in here anyway, and so I wanted to fit John into John 8 later in the passage around verse 42 to 45. Interesting enough, Jesus, this passage is interesting. I think it sheds light on going back into Matthew 13. Jesus said to them, oh, by the way, this is an exchange. This is just an excerpt of a pretty lengthy, I'll call it a heated exchange between Jesus and the Jewish people around him, I would say calloused, hardened people. And Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I have come here from God. I have not come on my own. God sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? No parables here. He's speaking in clear language. Because you are unable to hear what I say. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And then he says, yet, because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Now, this might be subtle, and I haven't done a thorough word search on this, but it doesn't say, I'm telling you the truth, and you're still hardened. He's saying, because I'm telling you the truth, you are hardened. You see the slight difference there? So I would propose that Jesus is saying to them, they're too hard to receive the truth, and not only that, their hardness is hardening more because they're receiving the truth. Now, Jason talked about fixing cars. He didn't say anything about fiberglass. But if you've ever worked with fiberglassing a car, patchwork, you got Mike knows this, you got that little bottle of hardener. You got the stuff in there, and then you got to mix a little bit of hardener, and then the hardener just hardens the whole thing up. Well, that little bottle of hardener, to a calloused person, is the truth. The truth is the hardener. Now, this reminds me of a video clip from a movie. And so I've got the clip. I'm hoping it works. We're going to find out as soon as we clip this. And you may recognize this. It's from a movie called A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise. And yes, thank you. Oh, that's not it there. I will come back to that in a minute. Are you able... Okay. I'll tell you what, I can mouth that. Just start it over and I'll say exactly what he's saying. He says, I demand the truth. I want it. You can't handle the truth. Okay, so thank you for that.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Okay, thank you. We don't want to get into an infinite loop on that. But, and I don't want to compare Jesus and Jack Nicholson. But it does seem that there's something about the truth that the people, certainly in John 8, could not handle. Okay, so let's go back to, our hard copies of the Bible, to Matthew chapter 8. I just want to read the explanation of that parable, and then I'll have a couple of concluding comments. So please turn back to Matthew chapter 13. So listen to the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word about the kingdom, doesn't understand it, the evil one comes, snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the one sown along the path. And the one sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But he has no root and is short-lived. When distress or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he falls away. Now the one sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the worries of this age, the deceitfulness of wealth, choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. So let me just tie these three soil types and connect that to this idea of the people being hardened. So the question is, remember the original question, why do you teach in parables? Jesus quotes Isaiah, where it talks about preaching the truth to hardened people is just going to end in not well. It's not going to end well. And Jesus then is really giving the answer to that. How can people be hardened by receiving the truth? Well, there it is right there. They receive the truth, but they're living such a sinful life that the evil one snatches away what was sown. In the second one, the soil has no root, or the individual has not allowed any root to grow. And again, a little bit of turmoil and conflict in life, and that goes away, and then that person becomes hardened. And in the third one, the worries of the age, focusing on wealth and other worldly matters, choke like thistles, choke. And the end state is perhaps worse than the early state because of that. Now, of course, on a good note, when the one sown on the good ground, this is the one who hears and understands the word, produces fruit, and yields, some 100, some 60, some 30 times what was sown. So, why did Jesus teach in parables in this particular case? To hide the truth from these people? Or they weren't ready for it? Those that were fertile can understand. Those that were hardened, they were just hearing a story because Jesus was hiding what that real truth was to them. They're just hearing a story. And you know what? Jesus' ministry was unfolding over time. And I would take that as Jesus didn't just right in those early stages, especially with the massive crowds, etc., just dump, all truth on all people so that they can then make that yay or nay at that point in time, that it was a process for them. So Jesus could actually have taken a compassionate approach here with the hardened people by teaching in parables, so they had that opportunity to get themselves into fertile soil. So that's just something to think about. You may start swirling around on that one a little bit. The case is this. We'll just bring this to a conclusion. That the gospel is not a mystery. Now, we didn't even go into the 21 references that Paul makes. But the gospel is not a mystery that needs some kind of hidden key. That key is Jesus. And at that time when he was giving that parable, they didn't have that understanding of who Jesus was. But his disciples, they were coming along. They were starting, they had him. They had the key. And that's what he was referring to. We have that key. Whatever the disciples had in the way of the key to the mystery, we have that key. It's no mystery. The mystery of Christ is not a mystery to us. We don't have to search for hidden, kind of secret meanings in things. It is there clearly for us. And to emphasize this point, let me give back to the parable. You know what type of soil you are. I'm not saying put your hands up. How many think they're in the thistles? How many think they're... But think of your life. Where are you at? Now, fertile soil does not mean that you're perfect. It means that you're open and willing. In some respects, it's the old saying, we're preaching to the choir, you're here because you have an openness to Christ. But you might be choked by life, the chase of riches. You might have very shallow roots because you're not paying attention to Bible study, etc. One of our primary responsibilities as followers of Christ is to ensure that we're fertile ground and that we are willing receivers of the truth. Let me end with something that one of the last, late in Paul's life, he wrote to Timothy. 1 Timothy, chapter 3:16. Paul speaks of the mystery. Most certainly, the mystery of godliness is great. He has manifested in the flesh, vindicated in the Spirit, seen by angels, preached among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up glory. Well, who's he speaking of? He's speaking of Jesus. Jesus is the mystery of godliness, and we have been blessed just like the disciples had. Jesus told them, they said, you've been blessed because your eyes can see it. And we have been blessed because we can see it. And the real question is what are you going to do with it? And what are you going to do to ensure that you're fertile soil and that you can fully take in the truth that we find in God's Word? May you be blessed this week as you consider these things.